So speaking of amazing people, I was once considered the world's top expert on Rod Serling. It is true. It was an undeserved and short-lived misnomer. But at some point, here's what happened. At some point between 2002 and 2004, I can't remember exactly because I used to date my sermons, I heard an NPR report about Rod Serling, creator of the iconic Twilight Zone series, of course, which I had mentioned. I mentioned this pro radio report to a church member at the church in Louisville who informed me that Serling had been a Unitarian, which so moved me that I decided to learn as much about him as I possibly could and then write it as a sermon, which became the original Rod Serling, Man from the Twilight Zone. And it turned out that very little had been written about Rod Serling back then, believe it or not. After searching bookstores and libraries, I found just 2 books. One was Mark Scott Zichry's The Twilight Zone Companion, which is essentially an episode guide, written in 1982, and a library copy of Gordon Sanders' biography, Serling, The Rise and Twilight of Television's Last Angry Man, written in 1992. It was also the early days of the internet, and my Louisville congregation had just gotten its first website. And I only had just begun publishing my transcripts online. Yet for a short time thereafter, searching for my name on Yahoo, before Google was the dominant search engine, resulted mostly in mentions of my Rod Serling sermon, because there was literally nothing else about him online. In a 2004 online discussion, for example, a person quotes that sermon, then says, "No reference is given, and I have no idea who Dr. Eckloff is." Prior to this, my transcripts were for my purposes alone, but comments like these actually made me realize the necessity of formally citing my sources since I was publishing them online, which I've done ever since. 6 or so years later, I even earned my doctorate just to make an honest man of myself. I also received an email from one of Serling's best friends thanking me for writing what he called such a fitting tribute to Rod, and letting me know that he sent a copy to his widow, Carol Serling, who passed away as recently as 2020 at age 90. I even received an invitation to come speak about him at Antioch College, where he and Carol met and where he studied theater and broadcasting and earned his bachelor's degree in 1950. I accepted the invitation, and I never heard anything more about it. Perhaps they realize I am not quite the expert the internet led them to believe. So nowadays, nothing on the internet connects me to Rod Serling except the announcement on our church website that I'm going to be discussing him today. My original digital transcript, however, or my original digital transcript, I should say, has disappeared. However, I did find a hard copy of it recently and was really excited to work with it, and that's the basis of what I'll be saying today about this incredible man who, although I am not an expert of, remain a great admirer and one who is inspired. So, in the style of Rod Serling, fade in. There is a 5th dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of a man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area we call the Twilight Zone. Imagine, if you will, a man trapped in a world and time not his own. A giant who stood only 5'4" tall. A man of peace who lived and fought in a time of war. A man forever bound by nostalgic love to his roots in a small town, but powerfully drawn to the bright lights and opportunities of the big city. A man courageously committed to his duties as a citizen of humanity, yet a victim himself of bigotry and hate. A man who may have lived longer than he should or could have expected, though his life was cut tragically short. Imagine all of this, and you might begin to understand the heart of the man we call Rod Serling. Act 1. Rod Serling was a plagiarist. At least that's what many of his critics claim, particularly other writers struggling to succeed in the area of science fiction. One very loud accuser, more than Serling's equal as a successful sci-fi writer and his fellow Unitarian, was Ray Bradbury. Serling countered that he had never intentionally stolen another writer's work. Indeed, all the suits against him proved unsuccessful, with the exception of one in 1963 that, on the advice of his lawyer, he settled for $6,500. I would argue, however, that Serling was an unintentional plagiarist. He packed a lot of experience into his short stature and even shorter life. Everything he saw, said, and did, including conversations with others, their shared ideas, the stories and articles he read, lingered somewhere in the back of his imaginative mind, waiting to be reborn in the Twilight Zone. Take, for example, its very first episode, Where Is Everybody?, which aired on October 1st, 1959, in which a man in an Air Force jumpsuit finds himself without a memory in a town completely void of people. After being driven nearly crazy in his search for others, the lonely man begins pushing the walk button on a stoplight over and over and over. And in the end, we learn the button is actually a panic button. And the man really is an astronaut trainee strapped within an isolation chamber to simulate spaceflight. After 484 hours being left alone, he simply lost it. As the host of the show, Serling closes the episode with these words: Up there in the vastness of space, in the void that is sky, up there is an enemy known as isolation. It sits there in the stars, waiting with the patience of eons, forever waiting in the Twilight Zone. Serling got his inspiration for this story from two sources: a Time magazine article about isolation experiments being performed on astronauts, and in his own words, I got the idea while walking through an empty lot of a movie studio. There were all the evidences of community, but with no people. I felt at the time a kind of encroaching loneliness and desolation, a feeling of how nightmarish it would be to wind up in a city with no inhabitants. There's even a scene in the episode during which the amnesiac finds himself trapped in a phone booth that he can't get out of. After several moments of panic trying to push the door open, he finally realizes that it opens inward. And in reality, this had once happened to Serling while on a payphone at the airport. Act 2. Growing up Jewish in Binghamton, New York, Serling experienced other kinds of isolation. Although Binghamton had its own synagogue and Jewish community center, things were far from great for the city's Jewish citizens. In 1925, only a year after he'd been born, a Klan-backed mayoral candidate won the Republican primary and came extremely close to winning the general election. Those were the years where membership in the KKK had soared to millions. and the state's Klan headquarters were located just one county over from Binghamton's. At the time, Jews were refused jobs, weren't allowed, to live in certain neighborhoods, nor have membership in the Binghamton Club, and that's a restriction that lasted well into the 1960s. Jewish kids like Rod Serling would also have to put up with cruelties at school, like having their examinations deliberately scheduled for the Jewish high holy days. Later in life, he would marry a non-Jewish girl, Carol Kramer, from an extremely prominent family, and as a result of their union, Carol was completely disowned from her family, which must have stunned both of them, including Serling, very deeply. In 1967, he told a Los Angeles Times reporter, "I happen to think that the singular evil of our time is prejudice. It is from this evil that all other evils grow and multiply. In almost everything I've written, there is a thread of this, man's seemingly palpable need to dislike someone other than himself." There's even a suggestion Serling became a Unitarian, as was common among Jews at the time, because it allowed him to maintain his own Jewish identity without being ostracized by the Christian majority, because Unitarianism was mainstream, so they thought. According to a Wikipedia article, which does include citations, he joined the Unitarian Church in college, which allowed him to marry Kramer on July 31st, 1948. According to an online dictionary of famous Unitarians, he was also inspired by the words of the Unitarian educator Horace Mann, who was the first president of Antioch College, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." And this further persuaded him and Carol to join the Unitarian Church, and they eventually became longtime active members and generous contributors to the Unitarian Community Church of Santa Monica, California. In a particularly disturbing episode, Death's Head Revisited, Serling directly takes on the Holocaust. In the story, an SS captain of the Nazis' regime's most elite guard is revisiting the ruins of a concentration camp where he's haunted by the ghost of those he once tortured to death. Their lingering spirits put him on trial and force him to experience the same sufferings that they felt. And in the end, he's driven insane, and we see the frightening spirits of the dead standing before us on the screen. Serling closes with that image of all the Dachau's, the Belsens, the Buchenwalds, the Auschwitzes, must remain standing, all of them. They must remain standing because they are a monument to a moment in time when some men decided to turn the earth into a graveyard. Into it, they shoveled all of their reason, their logic, their knowledge, but worst of all, their conscience. And the moment we forget this, the moment we cease to be haunted by these remembrances, then we become gravediggers. Something to dwell on and remember not only in the Twilight Zone, but wherever men walk God's earth. That was the only time an episode didn't end with the words, Twilight Zone. Act 3. In spite of his Jewishness, the athletic, handsome, outgoing kid with the great smile that everyone seemed to remember proved to be popular among his schoolmates. Once he graduated from high school, Serling decided to join the paratroopers. He was rejected at first because of his height, but eventually found an outfit that slid him through the system. Serling, however, was disappointed that he had been assigned to the Pacific to fight and not to go and fight the Nazis. Many things happened to him in the military that later became concepts in his writing. Firstly, he would begin his career as a writer for the military radio. That's where it got started. And he would take up boxing, winning 16 of 17 fights. His father would die of a heart attack at age 52, foreshadowing his own fate. He would be wounded with shrapnel. Worst of all, his psyche would be stained forever by the horrors of war, causing him to become against the very idea of war itself. In one Twilight Zone episode, for example, A Quality of Mercy, he takes a gung-ho American soldier, anxious to prove his manhood, much as Serling once was, who's stationed in the Philippines during the war, and suddenly transforms him into a Japanese lieutenant so that he can begin to see things through his enemy's eyes. By the time of the Vietnam War, Serling's anti-war sentiments had fully matured, and he took to the lecture circuit speaking against it. In a 1968 commencement address to a group of high schoolers, right, that's significant. Most of the time today, people are giving commencement speeches to college, university graduates. This was to high schoolers during the Vietnam War. And he asked, "Are you tough enough to try to build a world in which young men can live out their lives in fruitful pursuit of a decent enriching consummation of both their talents and hopes? If survival calls for bearing arms, bear them you must, but the most important part of the challenge is for you to find other means that does not involve the killing of your fellow man." Serling's liberalism probably developed after World War II at Antioch College, which he attended on the GI Bill. Antiochans prided themselves on their liberalism. They birthed numerous cults and communes and seemed to despise any and every institution. They had no respect for organized religion or organized education, for that matter. There, the students were free to set their own class schedules, going to whatever lectures interested them. They even developed a completely meaningless college anti-yell. Do you know this one? Boom-a-lack, boom-a-lack, boom-a-lack-a-beam, riff-raff, 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 ream. Ip, skitty, icky, wah-hoo, wah, Antioch, Antioch, rah, rah, rah. Now that is anti-institutional right there. In 1954, after the Cincinnati Enquirer lambasted journalist Edward R. Murrow for his historic broadcast against McCarthyism, Serling wrote a courageous and public response to its editor, rejecting Joseph McCarthy. His supporters and the papers, as he put it, campaigned to delineate people into either or classifications. Later, as television's Aesop, Serling took up the matter again in a classic Twilight Zone episode. The monsters are due on Maple Street. It's about an idyllic neighborhood whose inhabitants begin to turn on each other after a boy who has read way too much science fiction warns them that human-looking aliens have invaded Maple Street. At first, they pay him little attention, but slowly begin turning on each other, allowing unfounded fears and suspicion to destroy their once peaceful life together. At the episode's closing, Serling warns us all that the tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, to be found only in the minds of men. For the record, prejudices can kill and suspicion can destroy, and a thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has fallout all its own. For the children and the children yet unborn, And the pity of it is, these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone. Act 4. After he and Carol married and graduated from Antioch, Rod decided to become a writer and broke into the business as a staff writer with WLW, the same radio station that employed Earl Mark Hammer Jr., for example, who went on to create the Waltons TV series. Serling got his big break after Kraft Television Theater produced his teleplay Patterns about the cruelties and inhumanities of the corporate world. Patterns made him an overnight star and single-handedly changed the face of television drama. After struggling for more than a year to prove that he was not just a one-shot wonder, Serling did it again with what he considered his favorite work, Requiem for a Heavyweight. The touching story about a washed-up boxer who ends up selling himself out to become a wrestler was inspired by a news story about his favorite boxer, Joe Louis, who had actually begun wrestling for a living in real life. Requiem won Rod his second Emmy. The first was for Patterns, and later he would win a third, which was unprecedented at the time, for The Comedian, starring Mickey Rooney. Despite his tremendous success, the greatest television writer ever grew increasingly weary of compromising his work just to please sponsors. Having to change simple things like got a match to got a light to please the random lighter company, for example, were annoying enough, but more troubling was television's general tendency to stay away from anything controversial to appease its sponsors. Serling felt strongly that television was a kind of pulpit from which to speak against social ills. His conflict came to a head during the production of his teleplay Noon at Doomsday, about the violent murderer of an elderly Jewish man who was acquitted by the residents of his small hometown. When a reporter asked Serling if the story was based on Emmett Till, the true story of course, a 14-year-old black boy who was kidnapped and murdered in Mississippi, whose murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury, thousands of letters poured into United States Steel Company, sponsor of the program, threatening to boycott. As a result, the elderly Jew was changed to an unnamed foreigner. The word lynch was entirely removed from the script. They even wanted to change the character from a homicidal maniac to a good American boy who temporarily went wrong. That's when Serling gave up writing drama and created Twilight Zone. Initially, people thought he was crazy for going sci-fi, something considered unworthy of someone of his talents. During a 1959 interview, the famous newscaster Mike Wallace asked, "So, you're giving up writing anything important for TV?" If by important, Serling said, you mean to try to delve into current issues, you're quite right, but I'm convinced this will help my career. In 11 or 12 years of writing, I can lay claim to this. I have never written beneath myself. I have never written anything I did not want my name attached to. He went on to say, I think it's criminal that we are not permitted to make dramatic note of the social evils that exist, of controversial themes as they are inherent in our society. I think it's ridiculous that drama, which by its very nature should make a comment on those things which affect our daily lives, is in a position, at least in terms of television, of not being able to take that stand. And he was right about all of it. Not only did the move help his career, winning him 3 more Emmys for The Twilight Zone, but he found that the sponsors didn't bother him if he dealt with controversial issues disguised as parables in the form of science fiction, horror, and fantasy. Serling wrote 90 of The Twilight Zone's 156 episodes, which ran from 1959 until 1964. He also became known for his twist endings. and is the writer responsible for adding that closing scene to the 1969, I should say, film Planet of the Apes, where astronaut George Taylor, played by Charlton Heston, discovers the Statue of Liberty buried in sand, half buried in sand, realizing that he's not on another planet after all, but has been in a post-apocalyptic Earth all along. Classic Serling. Today, after more than half a century, Twilight Zone remains as relevant as ever. A couple nights ago, for example, I watched an episode entitled "A Thing About Machines," about a man who becomes so frustrated with his machines that he often abuses them, kicking his television, smashing a chiming clock to the floor, ripping a ringing telephone from the wall, and tossing a radio off the banister. In the open, Serling says, "In short, Mr. Bartlett Finchley is a malcontent, born either too late or too early in the century, and who in just a moment will enter a realm where muscles and the will to fight back are not limited to human beings. Next stop for Mr. Bartlett Finchley, the Twilight Zone." As the story proceeds, while alone in his home, Finchley is attacked by his machines, beginning with his typewriter, repeating the sentence, "Get out of here, Finchley." In what quickly becomes a nightmare, the TV turns on by itself and repeats the same message, "Get out of here, Finchley," as does a voice from the disconnected phone. Even the smashed clock begins repeatedly chiming. Finally, his unplugged electric razor chases him downstairs and out of his house, where his own car begins chasing him through the neighborhood, trying to run him down until he jumps into a swimming pool. He's too frightened to come out, and the next morning, rescuers find him at the bottom of the pool, drowned. For me, this episode, which first aired in 1960 when technology was far less advanced than today, before we had computers and smartphones and artificial intelligence, shows our fear of technology was even then great enough to make a great horror story. It makes me wonder if today such fears might be just as exaggerated. But I think one of the most relevant episodes for us today is The Mind and the Matter, written in 1961 about Archibald Beechcroft, a man who despises people yet lives in a bustling city, has to ride to work on a packed subway and works in a crowded office. Fed up, he tells his boss, "If I had my way, here's how I'd fix the universe. I'd eliminate the people. I mean, crush them, get rid of them, destroy them, decimate them. And there'd be only one man left, me." Hard to believe this is one of the more lighthearted episodes, given the protagonist's wish to commit global genocide. But after reading a book, The Mind and the Matter, about the power of concentration, Beechcroft concentrates hard enough to actually make everyone but himself disappear. Everyone in the world. But he doesn't get through one day moving through the empty city, traveling alone on a subway, and being completely alone by himself at work before becoming lonely enough to realize the problem wasn't other people, just that they were all so different from him. So he uses the power of concentration again to repopulate the world with people just like himself. Again, it's not long before he realizes that everyone is unhappy, rude, and intolerant of everyone else around them. He concentrates one last time, just long enough to return the world to its natural order, and he's more content than he's ever been in his life. Nowadays, it seems that too many of us, on both the left and the right, are utterly intolerant of those with different ideas than our own. and we wish to make them go away. Not with magical thinking, but by demonizing and discrediting and displatforming them so that they can't be heard or acknowledged by anyone else. Like Beechcroft, we want to make them invisible. Hopefully, like him, we'll also learn how boring and lonely and unremarkable such a world would be. And as Serling says at the end of the episode, that with all its faults, it may well be that this is the best of all possible worlds. People notwithstanding, it has much to offer. Tonight's case in point in the Twilight Zone. Fade out. As prolific as he was, Serling seemed destined, like his father, to live a short life. He smoked as many as 4 packs of cigarettes a day and drank coffee incessantly. On June 28, 1975, when he was only 50 years old, Serling died from his 3rd heart attack while undergoing open heart surgery. Prior to his death, he told one of his writing students that he'd been working on a story about a man who provided the residents of his small town with a potion for eternal life. But the same man had grown tired himself and was ready to die. Perhaps Serling was that man, a man who died just as he lived, with an open heart. Rodney Edward Serling was born in Syracuse, New York on Christmas Day, 1924, and liked to refer to himself as a present that was delivered unwrapped. His gift to us was his inspiring vision of a better world, a world of peace and kindness and understanding where all people, no matter who they are or where they're from or what they look like, are valued and respected and cared for. Perhaps he's there right now, waiting for each of us to join him in this wonderful possibility called the Twilight Zone. Thank you.